Man trapped aboard his own ship for years explains the wild story.
But before we start, please make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell and smash that like button. We really appreciate your continuous support.
Just because the sea is calling doesn't mean you have to pick up the phone. The ocean isn't always pina coladas and suntans, and the shipping industry that traverses it is even more fickle. Mohammed Aisha, a young sailor from Syria, learned this lesson the hard way. The 29-year-old loved his life and worked across the seas, but one uninformed decision left him stranded at sea for years, unsure if he'd ever touch dry land again. It was July of 2017, and Mohammed was the chief officer aboard the Bahrain-flagged MV Aman cargo ship. After 2 months of trouble-free sailing, the ship stopped at the port of Adabiya in Egypt. Mohammed was left in charge while the captain ran errands ashore. It seemed like any other routine stop. Mohammed was working on a few customary repairs when he spied a stranger approaching from down the pier. He squinted into the sunlight. The man was an Egyptian court courier. Curious, he climbed down from his post and made his way down to greet the guest. He had no clue how much he'd come to regret letting this man on board. The courier carried a letter that would put a stop to the crew's travels. It declared that the MV Aman would be detained in the Egyptian port due to safety certificates expiring. Additionally, the owners had debt that needed to be paid off. As Mohammed would find out, the ship's owners didn't handle their business well. The courier showed Mohammed a $21,500 invoice for a 3-ton anchor bought the year before by the ship's owner. And to make matters worse, their Lebanese contractors failed to pay for fuel. With the owners in financial hardship, the MV Aman would have to remain in the port until it was paid off or sold. Since Mohammed was left in charge, he figured he could sign the official documents from the court courier. A part of the document that Mohammed signed would declare him as the legal guardian, which his captain recommended to be a good decision. None the wiser, Mohammed followed the advice. Without knowing what he was agreeing to, he realized soon after that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. He hadn't realized that being a ship's guardian was a 24/7 job. Mohammed couldn't leave the MV Aman for any reason. When he realized what he was in for, he called the ship's agent, but there was nothing anyone could do. With no other choice, he settled in for what he thought would be a few months. But months stretched on, and when he'd been there for a year, Mohammed's despair got even worse. A full year and a month had passed since his forced guardianship began, and not only was the abandoned ship beginning to decay, but so was Mohammed's life. In August 2018, the trapped sailor received the heartbreaking news that his mother had passed away. Rather than allow Mohammed the time to momentarily return home to grieve, the ship company forced him to remain aboard. This was Mohammed's lowest point in the ordeal. His mum wasn't just the woman who gave him life, they had a close relationship, and she'd even taught him to speak English. When Mohammed wasn't even allowed to say goodbye, it hit him hard. "I seriously considered ending my life," he told the BBC. Somehow, though, his inner strength took over. Another year passed for Mohammed, and as inspiring as his resilience was, his crewmates didn't share the same spirit. One by one, they decided to leave, abandoning Mohammed in the process. There was the occasional guard who came aboard, but aside from that, it was just Mohammed, alone with the MV Aman and the rodents that scurried in the cargo hold. Nighttime was the worst part when the port was at its quietest. Some might find it peaceful, but to Mohammed, the dark and the quiet of the dying ship was like sitting in a graveyard, and it felt like he was sleeping in his own coffin. And as help began to dwindle, his time on the ship grew even more dangerous. Mohammed was given minimal support through the ship's agent. He was sent food and fuel, but towards the summer of 2019, those deliveries became smaller and smaller. There were even days when he only had small pieces of dry bread to eat throughout the day. It was at this point that he became desperate. In September of that year, Mohammed sent out distress signals on 2 separate days, trying to alert officials that there was no way for him to survive on the decaying ship. When no one responded, Mohammed knew that there was no way he could continue to stay on the ship. He decided it was finally his turn to abandon it. Surely the legal team would understand. The young sailor took a lifeboat and rowed it to shore, hoping to somehow cut through the bureaucratic red tape, but local police were there to oppose him. They knew about his situation, but when they caught him walking on Egyptian soil, they had to escort him back to the graveyard ship. Without an Egyptian visa, he wasn't legally allowed on shore. Mohammed begged them to take him to jail, but they claimed he didn't do anything to merit an arrest. When he was taken back to the MV Aman, it was like returning to prison. Only one thing would help keep his spirits high. Although he couldn't see most of his family in person, Mohammed's brother was also a sailor who often passed through the Atabaya port. Each time they'd wave to one another from their ships, barely able to really see that far, but each knew the other was there. These moments of reprieve helped remind Mohammed that he wasn't alone, and they helped him survive through what would come next. In October, the neglected ship began to flood. The already desperate Mohammed rushed to call for help, shouting "Mayday, Mayday" into the radio. As the ship began to sink with him still in it, a military patrol rescued him and took him to shore. But rather than provide him comfort after a near-death experience, both the military and the police interrogated Mohammed, suspecting he'd tried to engineer an escape. The interrogation lasted for 10 days while the ship was repaired. Soon after the interrogations, Mohammed was sent back once again to the MV Aman. This time, though, he wasn't alone. The ship's agent didn't trust him by himself and hired a retired sailor named Mohammed Kamal to help guard the ship and keep Mohammed out of trouble. At first, Mohammed was stern with Mohammed, but it didn't take long for sympathy to grow. Mohammed had become so ill from being abandoned that he developed scurvy-like symptoms, lost teeth, and was in so much pain all the time that he needed 12 painkillers just to fall asleep. There wasn't much time left. He needed divine intervention. Several more months flew by, and Mohammed's condition wasn't getting any better. It was a miracle he was still alive, but at this point, miracles were all he had left to look forward to. Most people wouldn't think an oncoming storm would be good news, but what happened next would be an immense relief for Mohammed. The storm arrived in the Atabaya port in March 2020. It was so incredibly strong, it blew the MV Aman 5 miles from its anchorage, just a few hundred meters from the shoreline. As terrifying as it was, Mohammed believed it was an act from God. He jumped overboard and swam his way to the safety of shore, where he was again met by police, this time with slightly better news. Seeing the shape he was in, local authorities were now more sympathetic to Mohammed's plight. Even after the storm settled in, they allowed Mohammed to remain on land until sunset, and although they still had to send him back, they did give him another bit of support. From that point on, Mohammed was allowed to return to shore every few days to retrieve food and water and charge his phone. Since he could only legally come to shore by swimming through the port's waters, locals gave him the nickname Castaway, and his story began to spread. He soon gained another ally in his court. Mohammed's case was not the first time a sailor had been abandoned, which is why the International Transport Workers Federation, or ITF for short, exists to support those who are being abused. The ITF began working on Mohammed's case in December of 2020, chipping away tirelessly every day at their goal, to bring him home. ITF's Arab World and Iran Network coordinator Mohammed Araketi worked with the ship owner, the Bahraini registry, and the Egyptian authorities for months before they finally found a breakthrough in April 2021. Someone was found to replace Mohammed so he could finally return home. The ITF managed to find a union representative in Egypt to take Mohammed's place. It was enough to please the courts, freeing Mohammed from his legal shackles. Once the courts approved, the ITF moved quickly to process Mohammed's immigration and also arranged for a COVID-19 test, which was required even for someone who was already in isolation. Mohammed was aware of what was happening in the world with the pandemic, but not even COVID-19 could stop him from returning home to his beloved family. Unfortunately, not everyone would be there to welcome him home. As he was packing to leave for home, Mohammed was given the news that his grandmother had passed away. "I will never forget the people who kept me here while I lost my family, one by one," he bitterly shared, before finally leaving the port of Atabaya for good. Living on the MV Aman might have been like a prison sentence, but today Mohammed Aisha is happily safe at home with his family, who threw a welcome home party for him upon his return. Although his past 4 years as a sailor have been a living hell, he says he still wants to return to what he does best. Mohammed plans to rest up, restore his health, and spend time with his family before returning to sea after his long ordeal. However, not every stranded story is as brutal as his, as a few boys in Tonga found out it's possible to make a great adventure out of a castaway situation. It had been a hot June day, and the 6 Tongan boys, Sion, Stefan, Kolo, David, Luke, and Mano, boarding school students in the capital city of Nuku'alofa, needed a change of scenery. Their strict Catholic school atmosphere wasn't suiting them. Though they ranged in age from 13 to 16, the boys shared a major commonality. They were bored and tired of school meals. Their solution was to go fishing, so they planned to sail to Fiji. However, being teens, none of them had transportation. They needed a boat. Luckily, local fisherman Tanila Uhila had a few, so already disliking him, they snuck down to the waterfront and borrowed one 24-foot craft. With a lack of seafaring experience but plenty of anxiety to get going, the boys didn't pack carefully. They brought 2 sacks of bananas, some coconuts, and a gas burner. Nothing more, not even a map or a compass. Late in the evening, they made their getaway from Nuku'alofa's harbor, not telling anyone where they were going. At first, things went well. No one saw them leave and the weather was clear. However, in the wee hours of the morning, they made a huge mistake. After dropping anchor off the coast of Tongatapu, they fell asleep. With no one awake on watch, a storm rolled in, breaking the anchor rope, and the boys awoke to a squall. The wind tore up their sail and tossing seas snapped the rudder. For the next week, the boys drifted aimlessly. Mano later recounted that they had no water or food except for a few raw fish. They collected a bit of rain in coconut shells, but the water was so limited, each boy only got 2 sips per day. But after 8 days, when the boat was beginning to fall apart, they spied their saving grace. An island jutted up over the horizon. One side was mostly sharp rocks and cliffs, nothing beachy or inviting, but it had a few trees and it was land. The boys scrambled ashore. This was the island of Ata, considered to be the most uninhabitable. It was once home to a thriving community, but in 1863, almost half its population had been kidnapped for slavery or killed by disease. So the remaining citizens relocated to nearby Ua. The boys didn't know this. All they knew was that they needed ground rules. They promised not to argue on the island because fights would likely escalate and become life-threatening. If things got heated, they separated until they calmed down and then reconvened to apologize. The boys also created a schedule. They did everything in pairs so that in case of danger, nobody was ever alone. They set up a garden, kitchen, and watch posts, and then made a roster to assign rotating duties. Every morning and evening, they sang and had a group prayer. In the beginning, the group ate fish, coconuts, and any seabirds they could catch. As they explored further inland, they discovered an old volcano where the former Ata civilization had been. There, they found wild taro, bananas, and chickens descended from those kept by former inhabitants. With the gas burner, the boys lit a fire and tended it constantly for 15 months. They carved out fallen tree trunks to collect rainwater, built coops for the wild chickens, and fashioned a rugged gymnasium and badminton court for downtime. To keep spirits high, Kolo made a small guitar. He salvaged steel wires from the boat, which was now in pieces, and attached them to a piece of driftwood and a coconut shell he had carved with the group's only knife blade. The musical boost was much needed. Rain was scarce and the boys were parched with thirst. They built a raft to escape, but it was destroyed in the powerful waves. One day, Stephen slipped and fell off a cliff, breaking his leg. Just when the boys thought they'd be there forever, passing fisherman Peter Warner noticed a strange pattern of fires on Ata. He sailed closer to check it out and saw a human jump into the sea swimming straight for his boat. The boy was Stephen, and he was followed by the other 5. We're from Tonga, and we've been here for 15 months, they told Warner, who radioed the news to the mainland. The radio operator confirmed their story ecstatically. The boys had been thought dead. When they returned to Nuku'alofa, a huge celebration was held. Doctors were stunned at the boys' good health, particularly at Stephen's perfectly healed leg. The fisherman, Tanila Uhila, was irate about the loss of his boat, but Warner purchased a new one for him to smooth things over. Warner had a new ship commissioned and called it Atta. He hired the 6 boys, now men, to join him as crew, and they were finally able to fulfill their desire to travel the world, fishing and seeing what lay beyond Tonga. In 2020, the story of the castaways resurfaced and reconnected the 4 Atta survivors with Peter Warner. News of this reached Hollywood, and U.S. film studio New Regency bought the story rights, with the survivors hired as consultants.